Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural India-Oxford Initiative and Korea University collaboration. A few months ago, Korea University and the India-Oxford Initiative at the University of Oxford signed an overarching MOU in the fields of humanities and sciences, and particularly the MOU looked at, besides facilitating exchange of staff and students, and how do we look at exploring opportunities for research. Importantly, it looked at how do we host and bring together events and conferences and opportunities for knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. And today's event is one such initiative and our inaugural initiative under this umbrella. When we talk about anything that's about creating knowledge and knowledge for impact, we're very delighted to have a division within Korea, which is LEAD. LEAD is our peak research agency, and among the many other arms that Korea actually has strategic oversight to in our research ecosystem. And we got LEAD to actually initiate this particular partnership today, which is India Research Insights, the COVID impact. The India-Oxford Initiative, and I will of course leave this for the people from Oxford to explain a little more detail, is really about bringing together all that, whether it's thought process, whether that's staff work or student work or studies, which is centered around India at Oxford. We are joined today by two members from the University of Oxford, Dr. Faisal Devji and Dr. Pramila Webster. Before we kick off the program, I'd like to invite our Dean for the Undergraduate Studies, Dean Dr. Bishnu Mohapatra, to do a formal welcome for this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kala. I think thank you, everyone. I extend my very warm welcome to Faisal and Pramila, and welcome to this initiative. And I also thank Kala and the other side of this thing from Oxford who were involved in making this possible. I also want to warmly welcome all my colleagues who are involved in this, not only from SIS, but other parts of the university. I also want to welcome the students who are involved and the student life who are also involved in this. I have just 2-3 things to say about any collaborative effort in these kind of things. One, of course, we know that the 2020 is ending, it's 29 December, but the conjuncture is not ending, which is to say there's one idea of conjuncture, which is that too many things are connected, but there's another meaning to that term conjuncture that we use, that is to understand how different things are connected in the world. What is the level of determination? How do they determine each other? What is the resultant kind of these interaction and determination, even at the final instance? So studying of any conjuncture, not merely 2020 conjuncture, COVID conjuncture, cannot be a singular affair. It has to be a collaborative affair. And so we are delighted that, at least at this point, we thought that Korea and India Initiative at Oxford coming together to reflect on this conjuncture. And the second thing I wanted to say that, which is any collaboration also tells us about our placement in the world. Of course, the pandemic in a very poignant way pointed the nested character of our existence, whether it's the global, national, regional, universities, society, communities, groups, and so on. And the India-Oxford Initiative is a celebration of that, our nested character and the nested nature of our existence, I would say. I was in fact watching the BBC's Panorama the other day on Oxford vaccine. And there are two things which came very clearly. One, of course, that the success of the scientists at Oxford, those who are looking at now that we have the vaccine ready, was didn't happen just because 8 months ago they started working on it. In fact, there's a long history. There's a kind of long historical condition in which this research actually was founded. And that made it possible that within 8 months, you find that the vaccine thing was successful. And it's also the connection in terms of the past research, knowledge, institutional settings are very important. And for collaboration, networking, going out to the pharma manufacturer, going to other scientists, looking at regulators, looking at statisticians, looking at survey research and all that. It is important that we, all these things are putting in place could really contributed to the success that they had. And other thing which that program told me, the panorama, was that knowledge is cumulative. You build on things. So any collaboration that we do between Kriya and Oxford today is also for the future. It's not merely about the present, because it's actually laying a foundation for things in future, where knowledge will build on things on itself over a period of time. And I have a special thanks for Faisal and Pramila, and over a period of time, their contribution and here the contribution of Kala and her team are absolutely fabulous, and everyone at both sides have really made it possible. And I welcome all of you once again, and I also wish that this initiative is going to be a success in terms of what we do together, because the doing together is something which is very important for this initiative. And so thank you and welcome once again.
Thank you, Dr. Vishnu. I'd now like to invite Dr. Faisal Devji who leads the initiatives from the India-Oxford desk. And just a quick introduction, Dr. Devji is a professor of history, is interested in Indian political thought as well as that of modern Islam. And his research interest by and large has been around Indian and Pakistani intellectual history, Hindu and Muslim political thought, and globalization and violence. Of course, his role at the India-Oxford initiative is much larger than that. And I invite you, Faisal, to just give a context of the initiative itself and your thoughts about today as well for the team. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kala. It's really a pleasure to be here at this inaugural event of our collaboration. And I wanted to thank Sundar Ramaswamy and Vishnu Mohapatra, as well, of course, Kala, you and your team and all the participants here. Just a few words, Oxford is a medieval institution and remains medieval to this day in many ways. And one of the examples of this, I'm sure Vishnu will remember this from his time here, is that it's divided up in all kinds of fragments. So all the people working on India in Oxford find it very difficult to meet and come together, because this is a feudal system, the way Oxford works. Everyone can have his or her own fiefdom. So the India initiative, the India-Oxford initiative, was meant to actually move beyond this fragmentation and allow all of us who work on India to come together, whether it is people in the natural sciences and medical sciences, the social sciences, or the humanities. And so for the first time, really, in Oxford's history, we've been able to communicate with each other in an institutionalized, regular way and act together and present a kind of single face to the world. One of the things we're very interested in, of course, is engaging with India, Indian institutions, Indian students, and Indian academics, and Indian society. Our agreement with Kriya is meant to do precisely that. And so I very much look forward to the discussions we're going to be having today, and very much hope that this will be the first in a series of other events and collaborative projects spread across the disciplinary spectrum, humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, etc. So very much looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Faisal. We are indeed excited. And I know there's, besides just the researchers here, there's a whole bunch of students on both sides, at Oxford and at Korea, who are waiting for opportunities to meet and work on, projects of impact. So thank you so much. Today's session will be co-hosted by Professor John Matthew. He is a professor within the undergraduate school at Korea. I can't kind of bring to say what doesn't interest John. You talk about history, you talk about medicine and biology and the environment and the reading or directing the choir at Korea. John's part of a lot of initiatives. So thank you, John, for stepping up because this is quite diverse and interconnected in some manner. So I kind of invited John, can you put together some sense into what we're trying to do today. So thank you so much for stepping in, John. I'll not hand over to you to actually introduce the program for today and to our audience so we understand how the afternoon will actually flow. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. That was very, very sweet of you, Kala. And it's been a joy working with you now and many times in the past. I look forward to much more. Thank you, Oxford. Thank you so much, Faisal, and thank you, Primla, for being with us and for helping us initiate this program. And we're looking forward to a great deal more. I'd like to thank my colleagues across the board, irrespective of what you're doing right now in the student body, at LEAD, in SIS more generally. So thank you. What we were tasked with doing was essentially to think about a flow for today's program. And Kala and I spent a fair bit of time discussing this. And it's largely divided into 3 segments. And we've got, not including the one we're going through right now, the introductory or the prefatory comments. And the first one is the one I will be including and is the one I will be introducing. And the flow really is this. We've got media, we've got migration, we've got women, and we've got mental health. And the flow of the day is largely along these lines. We thought that we would start with the media in what has been this most unusual of years, a year that remains to us in many ways inexplicable in the way things have turned out, and time and distance perhaps will allow us to make more sense of it. But we'd like to see how the media has in many ways shaped our own responses and our connectivity in many ways. We'd also like to see how this has influenced specific angles. And so we're going to start with the element on media, carry on to what is, as one of my collaborators, Kosta Vezencheria, the largest migration crisis in many ways after partition, and that is internal to India. And so we'll talk about migration, and that's going to be the next segment. And then look at a demographic which has been particularly affected in both these areas, and that is going to be that of women. Now, these 3 will be considered together as part of this second segment, and we will break immediately afterwards for questions to be asked collectively to the panelists that are involved. Following that, we move to a particular area that is critical, and that is mental health. And Kala will be overseeing that part of the segment as she moves the scarf, and she will introduce that the more. And finally, we will end with what's happening on campus with Samuel Prithiv and Satvika taking charge of that end of things. So that's really the flow. So right now we're going to media, digital media consumption as it is. And so what I will do is I will introduce each panelist in turn and the context in which they come to us. So for digital media consumption, we have Comscore, which is a leader in media analytics and measurement, supporting partners in planning, transacting, and evaluating media across platforms. With transformative data science and vast audience insights across digital, linear TV, over-the-top OTT and theatrical viewership, Comscore is a powerful third-party source for reliable measurement of cross-platform audiences. And bringing Comscore to us is Neha Singh, who is Director of Client Insights at Comscore India, and in that regard works closely with the digital media industry to unearth insights that shape business and marketing strategies. Her association goes back to the inception of Comscore in India, and she has been pivotal in establishing Comscore's authority as a reliable source of audience measurement in the country. Now, she has a decade of experience through versatile stints in media, advertising, and digital audience measurement. She has an MBA from Symbiosis, the Institute of Business Management there. And before Comscore, she was responsible for curating communication strategies for key brands at Saatchi & Saatchi. We look forward very much to what you have to bring us. Neha, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting things in perspective, John. Good evening, everyone. And in case you are in different parts of the world, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. So when I was putting, insights together for today, there were so many interesting things that for a while, I really didn't know what to let go and what to include. And finally, I came to the conclusion that why don't we look closer to our lives? Why don't we look at trends which somewhere down the line we instinctively know are true, but how about we put numbers to them and reinforce, and then look at how we can use them to change things, to sustain things, and to look forward to a better future that we have in our minds. So I hope today's trends are going to give insights and directions to the various initiatives that today's audience is undertaking. I'll just take a moment to share my screen so that there's no further delay. Okay, so one of the starting points of looking at digital media would be to look at how is consumption happening on various platforms. So I took something very simple. I just looked at desktop and I looked at mobile. And I saw that globally, the time spent on mobile continues to increase. What you see on this slide is essentially the percentage of minutes that are spent on mobile as a part of the total minutes spent on the internet. And on the right, if we look at India and Indonesia, we see that countries like India and Indonesia are leading the trend where more and more time spent online is actually through mobile. So what does that mean for us? Of course, we can use it in many ways, but a prominent thing would be that if you want to influence the masses, if you want to get your message out, mobile has to be central to your strategy. I just included some of the timelines so that when we look at various trends, we can put them in perspective of how are things pre-COVID, how are things, during the lockdown, and what happened after there was the unlock. So looking at this table, while we found first cases of COVID somewhere in January, but India pretty much was living its normal life. It was only until late March that we started getting impacted and we started into a lockdown. And then we had April and May, which were complete lockdown months. And finally in June, we started seeing unlock in phases. Now, what did that impact? What did that have? How did that impact our consumption of content? So strictly digitally speaking, as our outdoor activities came to a halt, we saw impact on content of sports and travel. So if you see on the left-hand side, you see content categories like car transportation, which would include interaction with apps like Ola and Uber, sports sites and apps, airlines, hotels, resorts, home sharing, which would be your Airbnbs and different sites of the hotels. Everything saw a decline. But because we were confined in our homes, our need for connection, our need for entertainment, more importantly, because they were uncertain times, our need for getting the right information skyrocketed. So on the right-hand side, you see increase in the total visits of content categories like social media, gaming, news information, even religion and spirituality, because somewhere down the line, we needed that strength within ourselves to look at what our lives are going to be, and we really didn't know what uncertainty lay ahead. But the moment, and all this trend is from January to April, which was, we were slowly heading towards the lockdown and what the peak of lockdown had for us. Now, the moment we look at the trend after the lockdown, so let's say, towards October, we just see the trend reversing. So if we look at April, which was the middle of the lockdown, and then we look at trends all the way to October, which is about a month or two away from today, we look at a reversal in this category. So you have slight correction in social media, news, gaming, religion, spirituality, though we cannot say that it was back to pre-COVID levels. The levels of reversal kind of differ. But at the same time, there was a revival in transportation, in travel, especially in sports, because we saw IPL coming in and it skyrocketed. So both for correction as well as revival, we really have to look in depth in terms of what is happening with these content categories. How much are they reviving, or how much are they correcting about after a huge spike? And what does that say about our lives, and how can we use that? So another trend to look at is business continuity tools. Simply because people were in a lockdown didn't mean that they would stop working, that they would stop looking or put things on hold. In fact, they became even more creative in terms of how to collaborate with each other when they could not work together in offices. And that is where you look at all these tools like Zoom, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, Microsoft Teams, and so on. And if you look at the trend, we are looking at the time spent on them, which would be like how much engagement was happening in these with these apps. And between January to October, if you look at Zoom, there is a 12,000% increase in the time spent with this app. We look at GoToMeeting, it is 6,000%. So these times, and I mean, this is the kind of spike that we have not seen ever in the past. So we know how COVID confining us just gave us another way of collaborating. An important thing to note is that while there was a spike, the spike started during the lockdown. But even now, after many offices are either completely or partially opened, the engagement continues to increase with these apps, which tells us the kind of choices organizations and individuals are making in terms of how they want to collaborate and how they want to work. And our offices and office space is going to be mandatory like it was in the earlier days. Another category of apps that has emerged are the apps which are required to track the spread of pandemic and get as much information as we need so that we can curtail it. These apps came into existence at different times and gained traction as early as April, to some of them gaining traction as late as September 2020. But this clearly says the amount of effort that governments took, that citizens took, and the key role that communication and technology had when it came to tracking and understanding what this pandemic was all about and what it was doing to the people. And it is interesting to know that India is the only democracy which actually made the use of this app compulsory for its citizens. And we had to download this app for, our tests for COVID at government centers and so on. And this kind of reflects in the kind of reach which is represented by unique visitors in the first column and the kind of engagement that the app had. Another impact that we see is of sites which are hosting content which is specific to kids. So this graph actually shows the kind of increase in the time spent that happened on kid-specific sites and applications between January and May on the left-hand side of the graph. And we see there was more than 100% increase. And after the lockdown, which is from May to October, there was a slight correction, about 19%, but it is nowhere down to what it was in January. Now, this clearly says that our dependency on online content for kids has increased to keep them engaged, given that their outdoor activities are massively curtailed, their schools are shut down, and even though they might have online schools, but you still need kids to be engaged with certain content which is safe for them, and parents are kind of flocking to these sites and apps. Home improvement wasn't behind, as homes doubled up to home and working from home offices and home schools. People had to refurbish their space, repurpose their space, and we saw that happening with people increasing their engagement with home improvement sites such as HDTV or Architectural Digest and so on. And it was nearly the engagement with these sites, or the amount of time spent on these sites was increased nearly 70% from January to May. And again, the reversal was very quick. The moment lockdown opened, they got some respite, not that they were still not working from home, but somewhere down the line, this wasn't the top priority on people's minds, and this trend quickly corrected somewhere after the lockdown opened up. We cannot talk about the impact of COVID on media without giving social media its due diligence. So social media is a fairly, it is a very largely penetrated category. 96% of the audiences who are online access some form of social media. It could be Facebook, it could be WhatsApp, it could be, just pinging on and posting on Instagram. And as of October, people have spent close to, in the month of October, they have spent close to 424 billion minutes on sites belonging to social media. Now, if we look at the trend, we see that in the beginning of, in the peak of the lockdown, there was a huge spike. The time spent increased about 32%. And while there was a correction after the lockdown opened up, there was no way people were going back to not using social media. People needed this to stay connected while they were confined, but if you look at the graph, we see that in October, which is the really tail end of this graph, at 424 billion minutes, we are still higher than what we started with in January. So there are certain, long-term habits which are being formed, and I won't go as far as that they're not going away at all, but they will take a while to go away. So these are the top social media sites and apps as of October. On the left-hand side, you see a table which ranks the social media properties irrespective of the platform. This includes their desktop and mobile traffic. And on the right-hand side, we are only looking at the applications which people are using to engage with each other. And Hangouts Meet is a new entrant in this in the top 10 ranking as a result of COVID, and the engagement and reach of this app really increased a lot. Another category that deserves a mention is online gaming. Online gaming normally reaches about 50% of the internet audience, but during the times of COVID, during the peak of lockdown, it reached as much as 70% of the online audience. And the time spent on gaming sites and apps increased by 92% between January and May, which is pre-COVID and the peak of the lockdown. And again, we do see a correction after May, which is the phase where the lockdown was opening. But as of October, the engagement with gaming sites and apps is still higher. So that says that there were people who took on to gaming, and there is a stickiness to this trend, and they're not giving it away. If we look deeper, we see a huge, Ludo King deserves a huge call out here. Gameshin.com, which is the parent of Ludo King, was a distant 6th in All India ranking, and it jumped to #1 during the lockdown. And currently, as of October, it is sitting on #2. And Ludo King, which is its topmost application, it continues to be the #1 application, and it surged to the #1 position during the lockdown. It simply talks a lot about how people are collaborating. Ludo King is a simple game. It is not something that needs a lot of skill. It is not, a hardcore gamers game. Even families can just come together with, if they're in different cities, and they simply started playing Ludo with each other. Entertainment was another pillar that was needed to keep people sane while they were in confinement. And it is, again, even before COVID, it was a very, the penetration of this category was extremely large. So in terms of, number of people who increased consuming entertainment might seem very small in percentage terms because we're talking about a huge base. But a good representation would be, again, time spent on this category, and we see that the trend is simply increasing. So again, there was a spike during lockdown, but the interesting thing is what happened after the lockdown, and the trend continues to increase. So people who got hooked on to online entertainment, they are not letting go of this habit. So what's keeping them entertained? What is happening within the entertainment category online? If we just look at these list of the top entertainment players, we are seeing that most of them belong to online streaming or OTT platforms or music streaming apps. Now, this is a habit because instead of going and watching a soap opera or maybe a sitcom on TV, now you are saying that I want to watch and binge back-to-back episodes on a Netflix or an Amazon Prime Video. Similarly, it goes for music, that I can have music on demand and I can stream it whenever I want. And while this was a trend which was taking shape even before COVID, this trend just leapt because of the pandemic. And before I end, I would touch upon some of the revival stories of sports. Sports reaches about 30% of the internet audience, and it literally reached 0% engagement in April and May. But then IPL breathed life into it, and we see it soaring high to even higher than pre-COVID levels. It's really interesting to see how it will be after this when, while sporting events are again opening up, but will people still look out for one IPL and give sports the kind of attention that it needs? Or is it going to be something which will be gradual and not chalky? And finally, we talk about travel, which was very, very deeply impacted. And it's showing some signs of revival immediately after the ban on traveling was revived. Essential traveling, let's say people who were stranded in a different city and now they were traveling back home and so on, started breathing life into this category. We still don't see people traveling as enthusiastically, let's say for a holiday and so on, but we do see some impact, but revival to the full extent is a long way to go. And what's fueling revival for travel is subcategories like car and transportation. That means people have started moving around in the city with their Ola and Ubers. There is slight revival in the online travel agent category. People are booking some airline tickets and so on. But as the graph shows, the complete revival is still far away, but these are just initial green shoots. So I would end by, 3 takeaways. People survived the lockdown with the help of, content online, such as news, entertainment, gaming, and being connected on social media. And some of these habits are long-term and they're not going back simply because the lockdown is open up. People are getting entertained online. They are taking on to streaming music. They are loving online gaming. And we do see deeply impacted categories seeing some recovery, though complete recovery is going to take a while. So I guess we'll just take the questions towards the end.
Yeah. Great. Great. Thank you so much, Neha. That was wonderful. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. I will invite people actually to use the Q&A box that you have at the bottom to post questions. You can do this starting right now, or you might choose to listen to all 3 and perhaps ask more synthetic questions, bringing these together. And what will be interesting, of course, is to look at the nature of demographics in the country, who's actually benefiting from these from the point of view of socioeconomics, who actually has access to these and who doesn't. And this is going to be particularly critical in the overall conversation thereafter, I believe. So thank you, Neha. And we're going to move on, and thank you for presenting. We're going to move to our next section, and that is going to be migration. And our focus group is India Migration Now, which is a Mumbai-based migration data research and advocacy organization. IMN, as it is in contraction, it provides services and interventions, conducts primary and secondary research, and gathers evidence for the purpose of furthering migration policy in India. IMN also undertakes extensive advocacy activities in the form of monthly newsletters, periodic migration-themed events, podcasts, and media publications. IMN views migration as an opportunity and aims to help India capitalize effectively on its benefits. And IMN is a venture of the Southeast Migration Foundation. And bringing information about IMN India Migration Now is Priyansha Shah. And Priyansha is the policy and communications lead at IMN, working on migration policy projects, and has been a part of the organization since its inception in the February of 2018. She comes with a strong interest in migration and has worked on interstate migration for both her undergraduate and postgraduate dissertations. The latter, her dissertation being on the financial inclusion of interstate migrant workers in Mumbai, where the field study was based in the Sakinaka area. She did the field study with the help of Ajivika Bureau Mumbai chapter, while her undergraduate dissertation was a field study of migrant laborers in the construction sector in Andhra Pradesh. And this is an area that is of passion to her, and she hopes to continue prosecuting studies in it further. She has also worked as a research associate at the Arbhar Consulting in Mumbai. So Priyansha, if you could go ahead, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, John. Thank you for having me here.
Of course.
Before I start, So I mean, like John mentioned, IMN looks at migration as an opportunity, and we work at migration from India, within India, and to India. And while all our research work was going on, we're in March 2020, and suddenly there's a lockdown announced. And the stakeholders who we've all been trying to work for and with we see them on the road, and we realize that while we're sitting at home, one of our strengths would be that if in some way we can get everybody together. And it just in a moment we decided to open up our office WhatsApp group for everybody. And I think in a couple of days we had organizations working with migrants, with different kinds of stakeholders in the group, just trying to help people all over the country. So we had help requirements coming in at all times, at different times, and people were just at it. So that's kind of where the work during the COVID crisis started. And while that was going on, we realized that there is need to reach out to the people who we had conducted surveys and research with before, just to kind of just check in on them. And when we did that, this was during and again April, May, we realized that while there's a lockdown and people are stuck in cities, even though they are in labor camps, people were not getting paid on time, and they also had no work to do. And this led to us doing a larger research as to understanding why the whole payment issue is happening even before pre-COVID. So it was also for us to understand if it's because of the pandemic, if it's because of the lockdown, or is it the usual delay in payments that also happens with migrants. And I'm going to start my screen. Yes. So the idea of this research was basically to understand who exactly is an employer. And when I say who is an employer, the idea is to understand who is responsible for the welfare of the migrant workers. And this is a case study that we did in Thane, Maharashtra. And we had also done a similar study with the same cohort even before the lockdown, which was in from January to March 2020. I'm going to leave the introduction of the construction sector because I'm guessing everybody already knows that, and the migrants and the construction sector has been is finally being talked about quite a bit. So just to give you an overview of this site, this was a private sector undertaking, and the contracts for the workers were both informal and formal. We were basically trying to look at 4 major questions. Number 1, what are the hierarchies at the site? Number 2, what happens because of these hierarchies? Is that the cause of the confusion? Number 3 was to look at the regulations that exist and see how they define an employer. And the last one was to see if there is a potential area of conflict. The way we went about it is we did qualitative and quantitative surveys and semi-structured interviews with workers in January to March 2020. We also we did semi-structured and unstructured interviews at the site with all the other stakeholders, like the micro contractors who are also petty contractors, the subcontracting companies, the labor in charge, and every possible hierarchy that is there. After that, during the lockdown, we reached out to the same people and conducted surveys and interviews on phone with them. This was in April and May 2020. And while we were doing all this, our research team was also just looking at the acts and reviewing how the definition of what the definition of an employer is. At the construction site, there were about 93% of workers who were migrants, and most of them were from the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and more than half of these workers were helpers. Within workers, there are hierarchies based on their skill, And a helper is basically an unskilled or a semi-skilled worker who performs the tasks of carrying materials or just helping the other skilled craftsmen. We also looked, like I mentioned, we also looked at the acts and tried to understand what their definitions are. And while it's only the Interstate Migrant Workers Act that kind of recognizes these hierarchies, but when it comes down to the definition, it's still very vague. So just to give some more context, there is the company at top, the company who runs the project, who then hires subcontracting companies. These subcontracting companies hire micro contractors who then hire workers. And even within workers, you have hierarchies based on their skills. Now, what happens is when you look at it from the bottom up, from the worker's perspective, it's their micro contractor who's their point of contact. So when a crisis like this happens and they have to reach out to somebody for help, the first person they would ideally reach out is their micro contractor. And that's also what we saw during our interviews and surveys, is that people were either complaining about their contractor or saying nice things about their contractor, that my contractor was there to help me, or my contractor has not been picking up my call. This led to us reaching out to the micro contractors themselves, and we did that both in Maharashtra and Delhi, and largely realized that it was actually them who were trying to take care of their workers through their own money, because their payment itself has been delayed from the higher authority. And this made us realize that this hierarchy and this confusion, it comes from the fact that the worker thinks their point of contact is the employer, while the micro contractor says that it's the subcontracting company for whom they've hired the workers. So here we just did a brief differentiation as to what the micro contractor said and what the subcontracting company, which is the management side, said. As per the micro contractor, the employer is the subcontracting company, because although it's the micro contractor who's recruiting the worker, they're doing so for the company itself, and it's the company who's responsible for the payment of wages, and if at all there is a delay. On the other hand, the subcontracting company was of the view that it's the decision on who becomes a worker at a site is with the micro contractor, and because they are the point of contact, it's them who should be responsible for the welfare of the workers. Towards the end, we came to the conclusion of, although I mean there was not a recommendation per se, but we realized that number one, there is this problem kind of starts with the policy itself, because it's only the Interstate Migrant Workers Act that recognizes that there are these hierarchies that exist. But when we talk about who essentially should be responsible for the welfare, that distinction does not exist. The other thing is that on this particular site, there were about 48 subcontracting companies, which would mean that even if each of them has about, say, 3 or 4 micro contractors, and each of them has about 15 workers, there are more than 300, 400 workers on that site. And who does this person go to when he's stuck in a lockdown? And that's what leads to the confusion. So while the problem comes from a whole policy and implementation angle, what we also realized is if one wants to actually help workers, migrant workers particularly, it's their micro contractor, it's their contractor who's going to be very crucial, because they are their direct point of contact. And micro contractors are essentially just experienced workers. So in order to help workers, the best way we realized would be through the contractors themselves. And that's kind of where we shifted our facilitation of help during the lockdown too, that we started reaching out to more and more contractors in different destination of migrants, and tried to help migrants through them. And I think that kind of worked for us. And because they are such important influencers, our upcoming projects, which is focusing on providing financial inclusion services to migrants, both at source and destination, which is going to be focused in the Bundelkhand Delhi corridor. We actually plan on using these contractors as influencers in Delhi and using them as agents to see if they can provide these financial services to contractors. So yeah, that's about it. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Many thanks, Priyanshu. That was very concise, succinct, and we're grateful. If there are questions at all, please go ahead and post them. We already have one for Neha, and we'll take it at the end of this session. We now come to gender, and we look particularly at iWage, which is the initiative for what works to advance women and girls in the economy. An initiative of LEAD at Kriya University. It engages in research and analysis, policy engagement and advocacy, and building and testing interventions in this area by collaborating with governments, civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector. It aims to build on existing research and generate new evidence to inform and facilitate the agenda of women's economic empowerment. And to speak on the subject, we have Dr. Sona Mitra, who is the principal economist in iWage, and Sona has been working in the area of women in development for the last 1.5 decades. Her core research interests are in areas related to women's economic empowerment. She has looked extensively into the causalities of low work participation rates of women in India within a political economy framework, and has studied in great detail the gender gaps in the existing labor force surveys conducted by the government of India. Sona completed her master's and PhD in economics from JNU, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where her doctoral thesis examined the relationship between macroeconomic growth and women's employment in India since the 1990s. Before her current position, she had worked with the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, CBGA, National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, and the Center for Women's Development Studies. She has been an independent consultant with UN agencies working on women's empowerment and a technical advisor to studies conducted by Action Aid, UN Women India, and ICRW. She also teaches a course on labor and development under the Masters in Economics program at Ambedkar University, Delhi, and also contributes articles to peer-reviewed journals, chapters in books, and opinion pieces in leading newspapers and magazines. So we look forward to what you have to bring with us from such an impressive background, Sona. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That was quite a long introduction and a generous one. Thanks for that. So I'm going to, I prepared myself for the 15 minutes, so I'm not going to get into details of too many things, but what I'm trying to do is present an overview of what has happened to the women's world of work in the entire, the whole of this year, beginning from the lockdown and in the current phase. But as I started thinking about what I could do in these 15 minutes, I realized that it would be very, it would be unjust to actually talk about only the challenges that has emerged for women in this current phase, because they are not in isolation of the past challenges that women faced in the world of work for quite a long period, in fact, almost a decade. And one of the concerns that we have had as economists working with women labor has been the secularly declining and very low work participation rates of women in India. And which is where I thought that it would be prudent for me to give a brief background about the challenges that women faced in a pre-COVID world in India, and also then have a continuation on that based on the insights that we have got from some of the IWage studies over this period, and also IWage partnerships, IWage studies, and also some of the studies that our partners conducted independently. So having said that, I just want to, I'll just share my screen and run you through this 15 minutes. Yeah, so I hope you can see my screen. And so this is how I structured the slides to understand what were the pre-COVID challenges in women's world of work, and then the COVID challenges in the work continuum during and after lockdown. So one of the important slides, and I think this is a slide which whoever has been working with women's labor, it's a very familiar graph that I'm presenting, that in spite of the decent levels of economic growth barring the last 2 years, the decline in fertility rates of women in India, improved schooling of girls, female labor force participation rate has declined in both rural and urban areas since the early 90s, and the female labor force participation has been as low as on an average 20% over the last decade, which has been the lowest among the fastest growing economies of the world. And this is a contradictory experience that India has had, because given the first few parameters that I talked about, the global experience has been that of an increase in the female labor force participation. But our official statistics shows us that despite such improvements, we have not been able to improve our labor force participation rates for women. And along with that, we also have to understand that how are women distributed across the self-employed and wage-employed workers in the country. And what we find is that we have a substantial, more than 50% of women are remain engaged as self-employed workers, out of which the share of unpaid family workers is a very high share, which is around 31%. So we have 53% women as self-employed workers, out of which we have 31% as unpaid family workers, which is to say that this is about those women who work in family agricultural fields or family firms, that is family enterprises, family business, small businesses, shops owned by the families, and those work of women are recognized as work, but they remain unpaid because that is taken as a contribution to the family. So although they are recognized as self-employed women, they still remain unpaid for their contribution to the economic activity. Other than that, what we have is own account workers, women own account workers, which is basically women's small businesses and micro businesses. And this is something that is very important to us in this entire COVID period, because what we have seen, one of the most important segments of women's work that got very badly hurt in the entire lockdown, where I'll come to that later, but this is one of the important segments, which is also one of the emphasis of the government to expand, basically to turn women into entrepreneurs and to basically provide them with facilities to create and develop their own businesses. Because what we have seen in the past is that women generally get into enterprises, small, micro, nano enterprises, not out of any aspiration or entrepreneurial aspirations that we talk about, but mostly out of necessities. And that is something that we should keep in mind when we talk about what has happened in this year, in the COVID year, because necessity-driven entrepreneurship and aspiration-driven entrepreneurships are very different qualitatively. Having said that, we also find that the regular work of women is substantial in the entire labor force participation that women have. But I would also like to highlight that regular wage employment for women, although has increased over the last 10 years, especially in urban areas, but these are employment which lack any written job contract, where women are ineligible for paid leaves with no social security benefits. So basically what we find is there has been an increase in regular wage employment where women are paid at a regular interval, but under informal setups. That is to say that they do not have any remunerations or any sort of non-wage remunerations which we link with decent work. And it is also important to highlight that there exist substantial wage gaps between men and women in this form of employment. It is also to highlight that some of the other challenges that the pre-COVID or normally that women faced in the labor market were the wage gaps or the earning gaps, and the earning gaps in self-employment is much higher than the earning gaps for women in wage employment. And to highlight that almost 94% of all women's employment is informal and remains concentrated in sectors like agriculture. If we leave out agriculture, more than 75% of total female non-agricultural employment is again informal in nature and remains concentrated in specific sectors in which are essentially low paid and have very low value added in terms of low and also low productive, which is basically domestic. Women remain engaged as domestic workers or within construction, as street vendors, in beauty manufacturing industries, which is a very big sector in home-based work for women, where women remain engaged. And women are also found in garment factories as waste pickers in the cities and so on. So you can see that the range of sectors that women are engaged in are essentially informal, low paid, and heavy manual-based activities. Having said that, there is another challenge, which is the challenge of invisibilization of women's work, which women continuously face, which is basically the issues of non-recognition and measurement of women's contribution to the economy, which doesn't fall under the traditional labor market, but it definitely contributes to the entire economy and society, and I'm talking about women's contribution to the unpaid work in the economy. And if we look at the current recently released Time Use survey, which was conducted in 2019, we would find that women spend almost 5 hours more on unpaid work than men in a day, and a normal work day for women is essentially 2 hours longer than a normal work day for men. And one of the important insights that the Time Use surveys provide us, with all its limitations, I'm not going to get into that, would answer questions if there are any, but just to highlight that while the Time Use survey tells us that while the 711 minutes of men's work are well recognized and remunerated for, the 518 plus minutes of women's work are non-recognized as work and does not get counted, and therefore remain unremunerated. And this is a process where women's work gets undervalued and invisibilized, and also to an extent that the official statistics cannot count and do not show a large number of women as working, although they do a lot of work in the domain which does not fall into the traditional labor market. And this remains true for all countries, but India has a special case because it is much more severe in India. However, having laid out these challenges, some of the important things that emerged in the lockdown around this year would be one of the important things that even my previous speaker was trying to talk about in terms of when she was talking about the migrant workers. Women, studies have shown, several studies taken together, including IWage studies, have shown loss of income by up to 80% in extreme cases, job losses in all sectors which have overrepresentation of women, that is those sectors that I just spoke about. In certain factories, what we have found is, and this is something that I'm talking from a small research which was supported by IWage, that job cuts have been more than 50% for women. And what women migrant workers have faced has been a lack of place to stay. And this has happened precisely because if we look at women migrant workers, the conditions of women migrant workers during the lockdown period was pathetic. One was extremely hurtful in the sense that women migrants were not really part of the discourse. It was a migrant worker discourse, and it was not, and the discourse was more about migrant workers, which was not focused on women. And hence, when we saw women were depicted as being part of the migrant family and not workers by themselves. So there was a problem of visibilizing the women migrant in the initial part of the lockdown, which basically means that women were out of the announcements or the benefits that were being provided by the government. And therefore, and also we found out that a lot of women migrant workers who worked at construction sites did not have the identity cards, which basically registers them as workers, and therefore could not get anything from the government government beneficiary programs. So this was part of the migrant work. But however, on the other hand, what we found in some of our, we have been working with the National Rural Livelihoods Mission very closely at IWage, and we have been we are working in 5 states, and what we have seen, or this is not part of the study, but some information that we kept getting in, and which was corroborated by all the media report, that there has been a potential loss of work under MGNREGA for women, while there has been an increased demand for NREGA workers. But for women, in some parts, in specific regions, there has been a loss of work because more returning male migrants to those regions claimed the NREGA jobs, pushing out women from those employment. So having said this, so there was one way in which women got pushed out from some employment that they used to get in a pre-COVID world. On the other hand, the other challenges got more acute, because what we found from a IWage Seva study of informal workers in Jharkhand and West Bengal, we found that 70% of women BD workers did not get enough employment or did not get enough work during the lockdown. And currently, even now, when we are in a complete unlock, the supply of work for women daily workers has not been restored. When we talk about the small businesses, the IWage and LEAD studies in Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu showed for women's businesses in handlooms and handicrafts, actually showed loss of disruptions in supply chains, impact of labor shortages, lack of demand, and also an exclusion of women because of increased digital dependence for market access, where essentially women lack the skill for getting digitally included. So that also created a greater challenge for women during the lockdown, where there was a high digital dependence of businesses on accessing market as well as accessing inputs. So for small women entrepreneurs, that was a real challenge. And since, as I said, that most women entrepreneurship has come out of necessity rather than entrepreneurial aspirations, what we found that these businesses were either getting temporarily closed, or some of them were getting permanently closed because of lack of technical abilities. And on top of that, what small businesses also faced was challenge. Was another small challenge of access to credits, because not access to credits, but also access to the moratoriums that the loan facilities or the government had announced, because many of the women actually were dependent on loans that they took from friends and family, and were using capital from their own savings and not from the government's programs, and therefore the moratoriums actually did not help the women entrepreneurs as much as it could have helped as much as it help the bigger businesses or the bigger ventures. So these were some of the challenges that that we actually got to know when we went into the field for investigating the small enterprises of women. Apart from that, there's a third segment which got exploited in the entire lockdown period, were the SHG members and the women frontline workers like the Ashas and the Anganwadi workers. Now these workers anyways, the Ashas and the Anganwadis are anyways entrusted with a lot of activities and a lot of responsibilities over and above the health, over and above their usual activities in any rural areas. What we found, and what has been a very common knowledge by now, that for those who have been following how women have been behaving in the rural areas, that women Anganwadi, Asha workers and the SHG members have been marked as community leaders fighting the COVID. Basically, they have been called the COVID warriors. However, our study in Bihar and Telangana for the women frontline workers revealed that while women were performing many additional activities, there were no extra funds allocated for their PPEs. And this became a furor across the country. It was not only our study, it became a thing for the entire country, and the allocation started coming in much later. However, what was interesting in our study was that Telangana, which was one of the first front runners of increasing the honorariums for Asha workers to 6,000 rupees last year, was one of the first states which actually went into a reduction of 10% on their payments in the lockdown period. So there was even frontline workers who are basically who are engaged in basically some kind of public employment. They also faced income losses in this period. And the last thing that I want to highlight is that all women who were basically catering to the returning migrants in rural areas and women who stayed put in the urban areas faced an increased burden of unpaid work. One, because they had been facing job losses, and if they are at home, the burden of unpaid domestic chores kind of increases, and also because government schools and other school facilities were closed and children were at home, the burden of unpaid work on women increased. In fact, one of the field studies and some of the other media reports, if we take them together, we find that 66% of women indicated an increase in unpaid work, and 36% reported increased burden of child and elderly care work during this period. So having said this, what I want to end with is by saying that the challenges that women faced in a pre-COVID world of labor market inequalities, which I presented briefly in the first part, and what are the current challenges, the current persistent challenges, are not very different in nature. We have a problem of women not getting adequate employment, women not getting expected forms of employment, and here we have in the current form the crisis, an employment crisis that we are undergoing, where women are actually being pushed out actively from the workforce. So what has happened in the lockdown and post-lockdown is that the challenges that we had become manifold, and is affecting not only women's status within the labor market, but generally their well-being in the overall economy and society. And we have been recommending a lot of policy measures. We have been working closely with the MWCD and the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Rural Development, and also with the Niti Aayog, but I'm not getting into those. I'll speak to that if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeni. That was comprehensive. And we're going to, in the interest of time, get to questions right away. I'd like to thank all of you very much. First of all, Neha, for bringing to us what was happening during lockdown times, and this very interesting trend, again, in a particular socioeconomic demographic, I would hazard, as far as gaming went, and of course, interests in sports and the like. I was very taken by the role that contractors played, Priyansha, and this is a key point that you actually raised, and something that cuts the heart of what you had to say. And finally, Sonia, what was critical even in pre-COVID times is invisibilization, but especially at this point in time, the added fact of injury of supplanting, even in that particular regard, by men, all of which are critical elements to consider. We have questions over here right away. Let's go with Venugopal Nayar, and I believe you have access to these questions, but let me read it out anyway for everyone. Thank you, Neha, for a very good talk. This is to Neha. Was there any indication of new startups coming up, taking advantage of the opportunities provided by COVID lockdown during the year? Neha.
Thank you so much. Great question. So in all the categories that we discussed, we saw a huge spike. Almost all of them saw a lot of new entities coming up, which earlier weren't even, tracked by ComScore. I mean, they weren't even on the radar, but suddenly their traffic started going up so much. So let me give you some examples, and I'm not sure if each of those would fall in the category of new startups, but they are, creating a lot of opportunities given, the COVID environment. So one area that comes to mind is something like short videos. Now, short videos as a trend was catching up way before COVID, but during COVID, TikTok really, brought it to a whole different level. Many startups started following suit, and then TikTok was banned. And that called for a plethora of apps being, launched like literally overnight. And some of them started showing up in ComScore radar, like Chingari and Bolo India are some of the ones that come to mind. Another category is education. So if you follow Byju's, if you follow Vedantu, of course their numbers on ComScore show the story that there's a lot of traction, but at the same time, they are also managing a lot of investments given the fact that online education is now all the more critical given, the confinement and children can't step out. Gaming, definitely. Online gaming would be another section, but I can't think of, actual names of the players and their corresponding data. That might take some time and digging and homework. But these are the categories that I can think of offline where I'm very sure that new players and startups are very active.
Thank you, Neha. Anuradha has a question for Priyansha, and this reads as follows. There is lack of data on migrants and thus recording compensation for them for either loss of work or even death, which has been a big concern. Has IMN looked at this, and are there any projects related to improving data on migrant workers?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think since you mentioned deaths, there was in fact only one record that was there apart from the government sources that actually recorded migrant deaths, and I believe that was done by some independent researchers that who were also associated with APU. Apart from that, at IMN, what we've done is that we've created a repository where we have micro studies, primary micro studies that are done in different parts of the country, the census data, the NSSO data, and whatever migration data sets are out there, and even the assessments that were done during COVID. We've tried to put it all together and then triangulate it with the micro studies, and that's what we have. I'll be happy to share the link with you.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. And Priyansha's typing out a second. We have questions from Shilpa Pandit and Mali Chakrabarti, and these will go to Sana. I'll take both of Shilpa Pandit's questions. What about 50% work for women under MGN REGA guidelines? and what would be your research findings on delay of payments for women working in NREGA? So let me take those first. If you can take those first. Thank you.
Shilpa, I mean, the question on 50% reservation, I'm talking about regions where actually women demanded and got more than 50% of the work. And those are the areas where we find that rural male migrants have actually, when they came back, they were actually taking away more jobs for women, and women were actually busy in household domestic chores, attending to the family duties, attending to the returning male migrants. In terms of delay in payments, we haven't really, for the COVID period, we haven't really got into that research because NREGA is something that we are planning to work on in the coming months.
Okay, thank you. And the next is from Malini Chakravarti. Thank you for an excellent presentation, Sona Mitra. As I understand, not much has been done for migrant workers in terms of policy response, but it would be great if you could elaborate a bit on the issue of women migrant workers not getting benefit from the COVID response of various governments.
So on this, I would just like to say very briefly that one of the important factors that prevented women from accessing the benefits that were announced by the government for migrant workers was that women migrant workers are not a not recognized segment. So basically, most women workers, and this has come out not from our survey, but from a survey conducted by the Azim Premji University, and that study showed us that more than 65% of women migrant workers are unregistered under the BOCW, that's Building and Other Construction Workers Act, where it is mandatory to be registered. And if so many women remain unregistered, it becomes obviously difficult for them to establish themselves as migrant workers, and therefore they are not, they cannot access any government benefits that have been announced. On the other hand, even for the women in the announcements by the government, there was nothing specific for women except for the fact that there would be 500 rupees paid to their Jan Dhan accounts. And for that, of course, the government increased the number of Jan Dhan accounts, but paying a meager 500 rupees, a one-time 500 rupees payments to a Jan Dhan account, or a 500 rupees payments to a Jan Dhan account for 6 months is not enough as remuneration or any other form of payment that would take care of women's needs. So I would say that, of course, there was not much in the overall Atmanirbhar package that was announced. But for the migrant workers, essentially, the problem was non-recognition of women as migrant workers, which is why they were not being able to access the benefits. Thank you.
Okay, there's one last question here, and this will be the last question, I'm afraid, because of time. Instead, this is from Sunanda Sangwan, again for Sona Mitra, and it is, during your fieldwork, did women talk about the solution to their problems of displacement or digital exclusion? Or otherwise, what solutions would you suggest to improve the situation?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a long question. I mean, that would induce a long answer. But what I would say that what our fieldwork suggested was, one, it actually highlighted the loss of business potential for women in terms of reduced market access, and also disrupted supply chains, which basically disrupted their inputs to the business. And it also showed some high amount of dissavings of women's business due to a high amount of dissaving from their personal savings, which basically, I mean, women essentially use their savings as working capital, and that working and in the lockdown period, the working capital was taken from their own savings. So there was a dissaving which we can actually think about as depreciating their own assets and wealth. And in terms of digital exclusion, of course, I would just say this much, that women not only have to improve on their skills of accessing the digital platforms, there is also a problem of owning smartphones by women. So what we see is that smartphones are household properties, and it is either controlled by the male members in the household, and women therefore generally do not really get access to the smartphones, and therefore there is a technical incapacity as well as access to digital platforms through devices. That is something that is that should be improved upon.
Thank you so much, and we'd like to thank Neha and Priyansha Sona very much. And if there are residual questions, we'll take them later along the way, but we will move on. But thank you all so much for bringing ComScore and IMN and iWage to us, and what is the wonderful work that all of you are doing. Many, many thanks. We move on to the next segment on mental health, and this is going to be both from LEAD and from Oxford, and there's an important paper that's emergent, and Kala takes over this section. Over to you, Kala. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was fascinating. I kind of liked when John proposed the narrative on. We're really looking very broadly at what's happening in the digital space. We're coming to looking at, I'm sure it's part of the news. It'd be interesting to see if Neha really tracked what sort of news was actually top of mind during that time. And we do know the entire migrant crisis was top of mind for a lot of people. And then talking about the women, which is a segment within the migrant workers who were hugely affected, and the impact of that largely on the mental health of the individual. So I think zooming in from the larger internet and all of that, actually coming to the mind of the person was pretty interesting. So to just a quick introduction to the next segment, we're very excited. This particular paper was actually led by Oxford's, idea of let's kind of proceed to do something jointly to cover the mental health situation. And given the time we had, ideally would have gone out to do a much larger survey, but COVID didn't allow us to do that. And we aptly had LEAD come forward to lead this particular study, if you like. So LEAD at Korea University is an evidence-based action-oriented development organization, and what they look to do is not only uncover problems, but also connect them to tangible action. This particular paper was co-done with LEAD and SCARF, the Schizophrenia Research Foundation. Sapna will be presenting on behalf of LEAD along with two students from the university's undergraduate cohort who worked with her and supported the presentation. Sapna is a research fellow where she anchors multiple projects on public health policy, strategy, and intervention. And she has a decade worth of experience as a public health specialist and researcher, focusing on health systems, from developing research methodologies, policy strategy, policy uptake, and evaluation. It is fantastic to have you here, Sapna, and an asset to LEAD and to Korea. We are also joined by Dr. Padmavati, who is the director of SCARF, the Schizophrenia Research Foundation. This is a mental health center and a not-profit organization based in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, and it offers multidisciplinary, comprehensive range of psychiatric care and rehabilitation services. Now, SCARF is also actively involved in research and in collaboration with national and international agencies to help understand what kind of mechanisms underlie various mental disorders and transform these findings into effective interventions for mental illness. And Dr. Padmavati currently holds the position of director at SCARF, and she completed a postgraduate psychiatry degree at the University of Bombay, and she's been with SCARF for over 28 years, and we have hugely to gain from her experience. So with that, let me proceed to Sapna to introduce what this paper was about. Sapna is also joined by Preeti, another qualitative researcher from LEAD on this project. So over to you, Sapna. We're really excited to hear from you. After this presentation will then be followed by comments from Dr. Padmavati and Dr. Premila Webster from Oxford, which, for whom this particular area is very close to her heart. So we'd be very interested to hear her comments as well. With that, over to you, Sapna. Thank you.
Thank you, Kala, for that introduction. And you made my job easier because you have already introduced LEAD and SCARF, which I was also planning to do. So let me share my screen for a moment. So grateful to Oxford for this opportunity and for the collaboration with Kriya, of course, ongoing with the students as well. So in the spirit of collaboration, like Dr. Vishnu was pointing out, I have Preeti, my colleague Preeti, and Kaustav and Ananya, who will jump into certain slides, some slides as we go through. The presentation will cover a bit about LEAD and about SCARF, and then about the study. Ananya and Kaustav will present a review of literature, and we'll just go into this results. We are early into the results because we just have done the analysis last week, and we are yet to get into the interpretations part of it, so which will be done with a lot more input from SCARF and a lot more thinking from literature as well. So as Kala was presenting, LEAD has a lot of the research that LEAD has done in the past decade and a half, I mean, around 200 studies and evaluations, and the number of households, multiple number of studies that have been done this time. When we talk about leveraging evidence, a lot of the leveraging evidence happens because we are able to have these ongoing partnerships with multiple organizations, whether it is donor organization, grassroots level NGOs, academic institutes. We also work a lot with the government and policymakers. Our expertise is across multiple theme areas: financial inclusion, we have livelihoods and entrepreneurship, infrastructure, governance, health. A lot of these studies are across, and of course, cross-cutting gender-based violence. We of course work with the iWage and other things, looking into gender-based studies as well. So briefly, SCARF has been around serving geographically the area of Chennai for the past almost 4 decades, and you know, their work, the geography, it's not about the geography that it covers, Chennai, but SCARF also does a lot of training and has been a think tank for mental health in India, and I think a lot of the organizations, NGOs within India do know about SCARF and the training that it provides. So it is recognized by the Department of Science and Technology. It's a WHO collaborating center, and a lot of its services, like I mentioned, has got outpatient, inpatient services, community mental health services, and telepsychiatry, dementia care, and they also work in research, training, and awareness programs. So they have been a partner with us for this particular project, and a lot of you know, what we were trying to do is looking at how COVID impacted each of these services and what happened, what were the challenges that they faced. So basically, if you look at all of the existing evidence that comes out when we're thinking about mental health and COVID, what we see is, you know, you have a lot of the evidence looking at general population and how did COVID affect them. While this is not an unimportant area, it's a very important public health area. But we have not yet looked in depth at health systems and how, especially for mental health, how these were impacted. Particularly, I have to mention the work that NGOs do in India. The National Mental Health Program that is looking at you know, expanding out to the communities is pretty much at its infancy, and a lot of the work is being done by NGOs. And a lot of this NGOs, Ananya will speak about in her literature review. But what we wanted to also then look at, this was a very important time for us to look at how are the community-based structures getting affected, especially for reaching out to mentally ill, because a lot of the mentally ill in India are living within their communities, are living within their families, and are given care by their families, and often in daycare kind of situations. So it was very important, and I just was reading a recent Lancet paper which was commenting that you know, it is very important time for us to look at the evidences coming from the ground, especially from NGOs, to look at how what are the learnings that the National Mental Health Program can take away from COVID. And this is a time for great challenges, but it's also a time for opportunities for us to learn and build the public health system for mental health in India. So for review of literature, I will now ask Kaustav to jump in and look at some of the evidences from international evidences, and then Ananya will bring in some of the India-based evidences. Over to you, Kaustav.
Thank you, Sapna. So I'll be considering the impact that COVID-19 has had on mental health services around the world. Now, you see, broadly speaking, the changes can be categorized as you see in the presentation based on its impact on the inpatient, the outpatient, and the pharmacological services that are rendered by psychiatry facilities globally. So on the inpatient side, we see that facilities have tightened up their criteria to admit patients and choose to admit some, but not all. And they also have reduced the time that patients spend inside facilities. Now, this is to minimize the number of people in the facility, and this also prioritizes care to those who really need it. And it's also called triage protocol in the domain parlance. We've also seen vulnerable demographics of healthcare workers being asked to work remotely in a healthcare field that is already so deprived of sufficient human resources. And for those who do work in the facilities, isolation wards have been set up to segregate patients who are COVID symptomatic from those who aren't. Furthermore, existing treatments have been modified, keeping in mind social distancing. And this is a very tricky thing to do, given the nature of free interaction between patients in the pre-COVID psychiatry facilities. Moving to outpatient services, the most significant change around the globe has been the deployment of consultation over the internet. Now, this has been met with much positive reception on both the caregiver and the receiver side. However, it has also had its negative impacts, especially on patients who lack the accessibility or the technology know-how to receive the care that they require. On the topic of accessibility, we see that patients who rely on medication were also impacted by COVID due to drug distribution around the world being impacted by a global commonality, which is lockdowns. As a response to this, telemedicine and teleprescription had gained the support of the law in most countries, and they allowed pharmacies to accept both electronic prescriptions along with expired ones. At a macro level, the similarities and differences between countries are stark. For one, the imposition of lockdowns in most countries led to a rise in new psychiatric cases and a worsening of pre-existing ones. While some countries could adapt to cope, and these are usually the ones with more sophisticated healthcare systems, others resorted to just suspending them altogether in the early days of the pandemic, or rather, I should say, early months of the pandemic. What is painfully obvious is that our global mental health infrastructure is not built to cope with infectious diseases. While teleconsultation services have been used to achieve great efficacy and reach, and they have, however, many have still been left out in the process. And across the board, there haven't been consistent protocols by which healthcare facilities manage patients during outbreaks. And this is perhaps the biggest takeaway for mental health services in the post-COVID world, that we need to formulate adequate protocols as we brace ourselves for diseases of the future. I'd like to pass it on to Ananya to talk about COVID's impact on India's mental health services. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaustav and Sapna. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. So my literature review, Sapna, could we go to the next slide?
Oh, sorry.
No, thank you. So my literature review basically focused on how COVID-19 impacted mental health services in India. And these, as you can see on the slide, can be broadly categorized into the guidelines released, institutional reactions and the way institutions adapted to these challenges. And the third and last category, which is very special to India, would be the action of non-governmental organizations. So talking about the first part, which is about guidelines and the impact on mental health services, the first action was taken by the government of India on the 25th of March when they released the telemedicine practice guidelines. Telepsychiatry was used to help cope with the increased number of cases as well as the lack of in-person consultations by government hospitals, teaching institutes, as well as organizations in the private sector. But the impact on psychiatry services that provided these services could broadly be categorized into a collapse in inpatient and outpatient care, as Kaustav mentioned, but also it affected specific treatments, for example, consultation liaison psychiatry and electroconvulsive therapy. a lot of these specialized treatments needed access to medical facilities, a lot of which collapsed due to the increased number of COVID cases. Another effect that this had was the redistribution of medical staff within institutions themselves. And this redistribution was basically because a lot of mental health workers and care providers were engaged in services which included helpline services, screening of people in quarantine for mental health issues, providing clinical care to COVID-19 patients, screening healthcare workers for medical issues, etc. And this, with this, we kind of get into the next part, which were the challenges that were faced. The first part, which was the modification of psychological treatments to suit teleconsultations and adapting in-person therapies with social distancing, led to a huge problem, which mental health care workers found very challenging, because they found that a lot of the effects that this had was poor rapport with patients, difficulty in diagnosing the problem, and a lack of empathy with patients, especially over video and audio channels as well. Other issues included staff management, legal issues, etc. There were also challenges in particular fields, for example, geriatric mental health care, because there was an amplification of issues in the geriatric sector with the pandemic, because in India, over 70% of the elderly stay in villages and rural areas, and most of these services were provided in urban areas. There was also an inaccessibility for older people to travel to these urban areas, which made this harder. And the last segment that we come to as we talk about mental health care in rural areas is the action of non-governmental organizations. So as spoken before, a lot of the mental health services provided in India were through government and state funded organizations. But another very key component to these service providers is the non-governmental sector. A significant portion of them work in rural areas, and some of these organizations include SCARF, an organization called Sangha that operates out of Goa, Abhaya in Kerala, Umeed Medico-Pastoral Association, the Banyan, etc. The first step was to create a distress helpline, which the public could access easily from all over the country. Sangat and a couple more organizations in alliance with the government of India did release the covidav.com, which is an online platform that was set up for people from all over India to access these mental health helplines, as well as it had a resource pool of self-help resources as well as helpline numbers. But more importantly, these organizers also sent out outreach teams to rural and semi-rural areas to help those in need. A lot of the reports on this, I must mention, has come from grey literature, as there's not a lot of published literature in these areas. But the work done by these organizations in rural areas is extremely critical to our study. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ananya. So next, we just look at the methods that we followed for this particular study, which was a primary study, and it was a qualitative study. We did in-depth interviews and focus group discussions. We initially mapped all of the service areas, and we also looked at different kinds across hierarchy. We tried to include managers, psychiatrists, social workers, counselors, all of the group, and then we went on to do 10 in-depth interviews, and we also did one FGD, which was done in December. This was done across November and December, and we did the FGD mostly as a reflexive exercise to look at where are we going, what were the reflections that the providers were coming up with, what were the thoughts, to summarize all of that with the focus group discussion. And Dr. Padmavati towards the end will also give some of our own reflections to add to that. So to do a deep dive into the results section, I invite my colleague Preeti.
Oh, Preeti, you're on mute.
Preeti, you need to unmute.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the earlier part of the presentation showed a really long list of services that SCARF offers. But for this study, we are presenting the results in these 4 categories: pharmacological, non-pharmacological, residential services, and outreach, research, and training. And this is really a 3-part story. The first part actually shows how the lockdown really hit the clients and service providers, for that matter, what was really affected.
And having come to the conclusion that, this cannot be suspended, that continuity has to be there, what were the adaptations taken up by the organization in order to continue delivering these services? And the third part being, continuously managing all the challenges that came up in these adaptations. So let's look at these in detail. So the first is the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on services. Like all of us know, there were issues, there were travel restrictions, timing restrictions, etc., and that really made it difficult for people to travel to the clinic and access these services. And second part is that most of them who came to the organization were getting the medicines from the clinic itself, but they had to find alternatives to get these medications nearby in their neighborhood. Things got affected from the service provider end as well. The number of people who were able to come to the clinic was reduced. Admissions to the inpatient centers was stopped for a while because of the risk, the infection risk that it brings with it. There were impact on patients with respect to heightened levels of anxiety and awareness with messages going around in the social media, the IP residents, consuming the news on the television, etc. All this led to a heightened level of anxiety among patients. Even for caregivers, it was a little bit difficult because a lot of them were facing job loss, pay cuts, etc. And on top of all that, and being cooped up in the same place and encountering interpersonal issues with their family, they also had to continue giving care to their mentally ill family members without any respite. There was personal impact as well from the health worker side. Work-life balance was severely affected. The timings of operations were stretched. They really missed socializing with their colleagues. And there was also threat perception with respect to them traveling to and from the center, worrying about putting their own family members at risk, etc. Moving on to the adaptation. So now we know what the context was and how the service providers and the clients were all affected. So what did the organization do in order to tackle all these, all the impact that they face? So the operations and management department is like the backbone of the whole system, trying to coordinate all the services together. So what they did was they first put a roster system in place where people came in rotation and there was a change in shift timings so that the in and out movement of people was reduced. Standard operating procedures were put in place even before the lockdown was announced. Like there were standard precautions like sanitization.
See, you're breaking up a little bit.
But apart from that, is it better now?
Yes, go ahead.
Standard operating procedures such as sanitization, social distancing were followed. But apart from that, they also changed the movement of how the patients come in and out of the building. Then there was a dedicated helpline put in place for anybody, like be it existing patients or new patients, to be able to access services, and they will be redirected to the appropriate service providers. The admin personnel also had to issue government mandated identities, and official letters were given for the people also helping in transporting some of the supplies and the people in and out of the center. Informal communication channels were put in place to coordinate the work amongst themselves and to make decisions, etc. So the most challenging part of this was that the admin personnel had to be always available on phone, because even though they had issued identities and letters, etc., some of the times the police would still stop them while they were commuting, the staff especially, and they had to always be on the phone to be able to clarify that to the police. So that was one of the most important challenges there. And also, if one of the people on the roster did have to drop out because if they got affected by COVID or if they couldn't make it, then constant effort had to be put in to make sure that the system was still functioning even if one or two people drop out of the cluster. So these were the challenges with respect to operations and management. Moving on to pharmacological services, there was a mix of in-person and teleconsultation practices. Remote case management was involved, where case managers who were assigned to patients were doing a detailed conversation over the phone about history, current issue, etc., and then passing them on to the consultant. And this significantly reduced the time that the patient spent with the consultant at the clinic. Telemedicine guidelines were followed, where prescriptions were written out on the official prescription, where pads with the address, the registration number, etc., it was signed. Pictures were taken and shared over WhatsApp. So, although this worked really well for people to continue taking their treatments and medications, some of the challenges were that patients would call the consultants or the staff, trying to understand the prescription and meet the challenges that the pharmacists were, presenting with respect to understanding what the real medicine is, what is the chemical name versus the brand name, the duration of the prescription, etc. Moving on to non-pharmacological services, the psychosocial rehabilitation, vocational rehabilitation activities were all shifted to an audio or a video call mode. The rehabilitation center itself was closed down and it was all done over phone. With respect to residential centers, visitors were not allowed to visit their inpatients due to the risk of infection. But the people working there, the staff working in these residential centers, took personal initiatives and helped connect the inpatients to their families over audio and video calls using their own personal mobile phones. And even here, the very similar authentication problem happened, where if they had to discharge an inpatient, the admin personnel had to issue letters explaining the reason for commuting, the family members to commute to the center and take the patient from the center back home. So again, they had to be available on the phone to clarify to the police the reason for which they are. Outreach, training, and research were all again shifted to virtual mode. Both academic programs that were run by staff and those programs where they were supporting practical exposure for students studying in college were all shifted to virtual mode. Some of the group sessions had to be shifted to one-on-one mode because different institutions ended up following different timelines and different syllabus, etc. For research projects, data was collected again on the virtual mode. Video conferencing method was employed for public outreach programs. While all of them really did not, maybe there would have been a brief break, but there was continuity was ensured in outreach training and research services as well. So that's what I have from myself.
Thank you very much, Preeti, for the deep dive. So we come out of that deep dive into looking at some of the insights and reflections that we have. And we have that in three areas, mainly the professional or organizational level. We have one at the personal level and one that was drawn in terms of policy and environment. What are the changes or what are the insights that can be drawn? So at the professional level and at the organization level, something that SCARF, the service providers at SCARF felt that, while they had a lot of experience from handling the tsunami in 2004 and the Chennai floods that happened in 2050, and there were a lot of learnings, telepsychiatry they were already doing, and a lot of those things were happening, and they already had a psychoeducation program existing for adherence and compliance to treatment. But yet they thought that there were additional guidelines and trainings that are required, especially for caregivers, because in a pandemic situation, a lot of the things are pushed onto the caregivers. So that kind of, you want to kind of strengthen your caregiver arm in that sense. So for the personal from the personal level, basically a lot of the care part of it and being valued for providing care. Often, the doctor-patient ratio in India is such that personalized care is often not possible because you're already you have a queue waiting outside. So in COVID, using of the virtual communication did make it a lot more personalized, and they did feel a lot more valued. A lot of the communication with your colleagues became more informal, and that led to people being able to respond much faster. And a similar thing that that's observed in the policy and environment is that there are Chennai have a city level disaster management plan, as do a lot of other cities in India. But do we have one in which we are also thinking about our mental health services? Do we have one in which we're thinking about are mentally ill? How do you move them? What do you do with them? And also about the case of homeless, because a lot of our mentally ill become homeless. What do you do that? In terms of context of travel restrictions and often telemedicine guidelines does not involve how the pharmacist how they will decide who is like a proper patient, who's not, and these are kind of things that are going to play out, and these also need a lot more guidelining. So in gist, if I were to look at the highlights of what came out, there were adaptations included a lot of personal initiatives, including personal phones, because we are from a resource poor setting. Personal phones, personal time being used. Of course, there is, and also they were involved in a lot of welfare activities for caregivers and families who were known to them, and also continuous action was required, because a lot of the challenges were thrown because people do not understand mental illness in India, and there is kind of there were restrictions because of that. Teleconsultation, like I mentioned in the beginning, this is going to be like a huge area that's going to kind of be very important for India in the coming years, because if you look at psychiatrists, we need 3 per 100,000 population, and we have now less than 0.75. So which means that we have to think about teleconsultation a lot more. But there are problems, like you have to, especially, I don't know if this is an India-based problem, or it's always drawing boundaries, demands from the clients, family involvement to personal issues. I'm sure there are a lot more. We need to look at some of the findings from international studies to look more into this. And what the service provider faces in terms of work-life balance is also quite important, because if you're going to take the same number of doctors and then stretch them to provide services on teleconsultation to all of the patients, then it does have an effect on the service providers. So there are insights, including that can be used for psychiatric guidelines, telemedicine guidelines, and also for city-based guidelines, which will be, and also organization-based guidelines, which SCARF is also involved in kind of looking at. So I think that's all from the study at this point. Like I said, we are too early for a lot of interpretation, drawing a lot of interpretations. But there are it was quite an interesting exercise to look at across COVID, how the patient the patient and service provider relationship kind of matured, and there is definitely a chance for opportunities for us to learn, especially the public health services in mental health to learn. Thank you. So I think next.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Sapna. Thank you very much. So Dr. Padmavati, yes, over to you for some reflections. And then what we might do after that is just get Sam to do the 5-minute overview, because I'm kind of conscious of time. And then we'll have Pramila to reflect on the whole space of mental health. So we cover the whole area. So Dr. Padmavati, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kala. And thank you to Preeti and Sapna to have put this together. Really, when you're actually in the middle of, swimming the sea of the pandemic, it was very hard to get an outside perspective. And when somebody like Kriya and comes in to say, Kriya and Lead come in to, say that this is what they're going to do, it really was a wonderful opportunity for us to get an insight from an outside, if you get the meaning. So to me, some of, as we were reflecting over the last 2-3 weeks of work that was happening, essentially it started as a conversation with the mental health professionals themselves and not really talking to patients, because that would mean, we would have to design a better study and so on. So here it was like, what struck me as very, this has been ongoing right from the word go. Whatever the disaster situations we have faced, we were very acutely aware of the need to sustain continuity of mental health services. And all our activities, all our actions, all our decisions were based on being available, to remain approachable to our patients and their their families. And the pandemic actually told us that we had to remain available to even people who are not actually taking treatment from us, not just the serious mentally ill, but also young people who are simply anxious about the situation, elderly who are very anxious and need not really have a diagnosable psychiatric problem, but we do need to remain available to them. So overall, our welfare for the patient population was critical, in a sense that there were times when we had to even provide basic sustenance in terms of food to our patient population, particularly in the rural areas of Chengalpet and Pudukkottai, where we are running active programs, mainly research programs. But I think the biggest learning biggest learnings for me in this was managing our own personal emotional turmoils. It's all well, to say, okay, a person with schizophrenia, a person with anxiety disorders requires help. But what about our own anxiety? Sometimes, we tend to say that, I can't talk about my anxieties when I have to be dealing with the anxieties of other people. But fortunately, in this period, this pandemic period, we also learned to vocalize, to verbalize our own anxieties, our own apprehensions about, the whole COVID systems, not just about ourselves, but also our families and so on. And there were many quarrels, there were many, disagreements. But I think overall, we turned the tide, we learned to live with each other, we learned to live with our own decisions. And it's been a huge learning curve in terms of, managing this kind of a situations, and has also, opened our eyes to the need for areas where we do need to, persist in learning more. Thank you very much to the entire team for this workshop. I think it has been phenomenal. I've been listening through to all the presentations, and really it was something very different from what I've experienced before. So thank you, Kala.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Padmavati. What I do is just, and it's fantastic, you kind of touched on your reflections about the overall welfare of the patient population and all those who may have been there who might need assistance. And we cannot quite ignore, when you're talking about the population of the student population at this stage, because of, what they have been through this year. So I'm going to quickly hand this over to John for the next final 5 minutes before we reflect back to Dr. Pramila for her final comments as well, and then leave some time for some questions. Thanks, John. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kala, and thank you, Sapna and Preeti.
I can stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, please do. And Ananya and Dr. Padmavati. We're moving right now into what's happening on campus, and we're giving this over to Samuel Prithib and Satvika Chah. So what I'll do is I'll present the slides and we'll take it from there. And all questions will be taken after Pramila has spoken at the very end. Yeah, cool. So thank you very much for that. Can you see these? Kala, can you see this? I can't hear you.
Yes, John, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Cool. Okay, let me just go to present.
Full screen that, please.
Yes, I shall do.
You can scroll, otherwise it's all right here.
No, I just want to go to present.
Oh, present on the right top.
Yeah, done. Yeah,
thank you.
Cool. There you go.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samuel Prithib. I serve with the Office of Student Life at Kriya University. I'll be co-presenting on Wellness is Collective Action with Satvika Char. This presentation will cover an overview of our mental health initiatives on campus and online. It'll specifically focus on the conception, the design, and the pilot launch of our peer-to-peer counseling program. Next slide, please, John. So wellness is really a lifestyle at Kriya from an all-round perspective, and we label this wellness as collective action as we believe in each individual's agency to aid in their wellness journey and those of our others around them. From faculty, staff, and students, the psycho-socio-emotional wellness is an integral value in the Kriya community. Owing to this, our undergraduate student body comprises 18 student-led clubs and societies that really set a rhythm for healthy social interactions on campus. John, could you please move on to the next slide? Thank you. So these are some of our other wellness initiatives that we're really passionate about at Kriya. Firstly, we have the faculty mentorship program. Each faculty mentor is assigned between 8 and 10 students to help their mentees through their journey at Kriya University, as it is a residential program. We also have a buddy system that we initiated, that was initiated by our orientation team of students this year. And this initiative was started during the orientation week. It went on through the first and second trimesters as well. It was conceptualized as a way for incoming students to interact with the senior students. We also have, additionally, you see Yordos and SCARF there, and you've heard a fair bit of what SCARF does. And so we're really grateful to be partnering with them. They provide us with psychological and psychiatric services that are provided online, which is so integral at this time. And Yordos is a counseling service that provides text-based counseling on a 24/7 basis. And it's really interesting to see the age demographics of people who use this service versus SCARF. And each partner periodically organizes webinars on mental health awareness and self-care. Additionally, we've launched 2 wellness internships for students through the Office of Student Life. These internships were really to understand the mental and emotional needs of our student body. And these were done through extensive surveys and an organization of a wellness dashboard that we'd like to visit and really learn from as we progress in our journey as a university. What's interesting is the inputs from these surveys made it pretty clear that a peer-to-peer counseling program could benefit our undergraduate student body. And I'll let Satvika take us through our reasoning for that.
Thank you so much. Could you go to the next slide, John? Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm Satvika Char, and I'm a second-year student at Kriya, majoring in psychology. So Samuel briefly touched upon the peer support program. So to take that further, let's look at some of the context that pointed us towards the conceptualization of this program. So in the month of April, the Office of Student Life sent out 2 surveys to the student body to understand student wellness and help them work towards improving social life on campus. So these surveys were completely anonymous and they were filled by 80% of our student body. So as you can see from the pie charts on the screen, when students were asked how often they were confused about the intentions of others towards them, a majority of them said that they were frequently or very frequently confused about the same. Then when asked how likely they were to ask friends and relatives for help when highly stressed, again, a majority said that they were unlikely or very unlikely to do so. Moving on to the next slide. What is interesting to note is that when students were asked if they'd be open to approaching trained students who were volunteers in an effective peer counseling system, a huge majority were open to the possibility and even said yes, and the number of hard no's were below 20%. Additionally, when students were asked if they would like to be an active part of this program and become trained peer support volunteers, 69.2% of the students said yes. Next slide, please, John. To also get some insight into the socio-cultural context that cemented the need for this peer support program. So our Kriya student body has students whose hometowns are in places all across the country. Students come from diverse economic and regional backgrounds. So let's just take a moment and step into the shoes of one such student. Imagine you're a student from a remote part of the country, traveling to settle down in a campus that is 60 kilometers away from the nearest city. You've never lived alone before. There are all the challenges that come with living in a residential program. You have to figure out how to do your own laundry, for instance. So there's also academic pressure from studying a curriculum unlike the ones that you've been used to. Amidst all the stress, throw in the additional stigma that is now associated with mental health coming from external social conditioning. As a result of this, the power distance between a student and a professional counselor too increases. So with Kriya being a new university, we have a smaller body of students and the need for a sense of community is strong. In such a situation like this, a peer support program, which is a community initiative basically, where students are trained in areas such as active listening, confidentiality, maintaining boundaries, etc., which enables them to then provide assistance and support to students who approach them, acts as a bridge between talking to, say, just a friend, for instance, and talking to a professional. And it can even serve as the first step towards resolving some of the stigma that surrounds you. So now that we established the need for a peer support program, Samuel will walk us through how we went about putting it together. Over to you, Samuel.
Thank you, Satvika. John, next slide, please. All right. So Satvika has really laid the foundation for the context and the reasoning behind our launch of the peer support program. So in this section, I'll really talk about the partnership with SCARF and how things move forward and how we launched the program. So given SCARF's experience in developing youth mental health initiatives, we decided to launch the program, the peer support program, through this partnership. Typically, it's an on-campus initiative, but we felt that the present extenuating circumstances brought on by the COVID-19 virus necessitated an online launch for the peer support program. And we launched the application was sent out in August of 2020. And from our 113 strong student body at the time, we got 40 students to apply through written application. All applicants, we decided that we'd want to train all the applicants and then we would have the interviews at the end because we wanted students to be able to employ those skills even in their relationship with their peers outside the program, even if they didn't get selected. And so they received 16 hours of free training over a period of 8 weeks by SCARF. They went through different role play scenarios, and this helped them develop lay counseling skills and also how to navigate ethical boundaries when dealing with their peers. At the end, we also had additional interviews to evaluate the students. There were about 15 students that started to serve as peer support volunteers on a completely voluntary basis. We also put in protocols in case of harm to self or others. We also had in terms of support structures, we had one psychologist from SCAR who would serve as a mentor for a group of 5 peer support volunteers. So essentially, these groups would serve as microcosms of support for the students, especially when this program is launched online. And we wouldn't want our students to be serving out of an empty well. And lastly, the volunteers also have access to individual support sessions with their mentors every month. So the group sessions are every week or every 2 weeks, depending on the mentor, and the individual mentor sessions are every week. Next slide, please, John. So here we'll really look at some of the feedback that we received 3 months into the program. We understood that some things changed, and since it's an online program, there are things that we would have to reevaluate. So 3 months into the launch, we organized one-on-one interviews with each of the peer support volunteers to understand the ground reality of the program's function. Additionally, we sent out a feedback survey to the entire student body. We learned that 10% of our student body has made use of the program. Incoming students reached out to the program more than the second year students. Most challenges, interestingly, that were brought up involved social social and academic issues in addition to mental emotional distress. So this was pretty heartening to hear. The few testimonials that we did receive from a feedback survey were highly favorable. Our reading of the survey responses has revealed that a small portion of students receive immense support from the program and have advised us not to stop the program. And The survey also included a set of questions to understand the needs of those who do not use the program. A majority of students felt that the information they shared with their peers in this program might be compromised. They also expressed that they did not feel like the volunteers might be prepared enough. And 35% mentioned that they didn't feel comfortable reaching out to the program because they weren't acquainted with their peers, with their peer support volunteers. And this is hard to do in an online setting. So in the next slide, Satvika will really take us through our next steps with respect to what we've learned from these surveys. Next slide, please, John.
Right. Thank you, Samuel. So as Sam pointed out from the feedback that has been received from the survey, there is a lot of things that we can do in order to make the program more efficient and work on it a little bit more. So around after 3 months into the program, a focus group, of which I'm a part of as well, was organized from amongst the 15 peer support volunteers in order to consolidate the feedback from our mental health partners, which is SCARF, from the students and our peer support volunteers. So this focus group has met with Samuel to outline ways in which we can make the program more efficient and broaden its reach. One of the ways that we thought about going about this was in terms of accessibility. So currently the students were asked to state their reason for reaching out to a peer support volunteer through email. However, the surveys reveal that 50% of the students have expressed that they have been reaching out using text or call, which indicates a preference for the same. We therefore want to make the possibility of reaching out to a volunteer accessible through multiple channels of communication, including text and call. Another area where there seemed to be some lack of clarity was when it came to the purpose of reaching out to the volunteers. Students seem to have different perceptions of what reasons they could approach volunteers for and what reasons they couldn't. So to make this easier, we plan on taking the burden of responsibility completely off the backs of the students and rather brief the volunteers on how they can guide the students or who they should refer them to in case of any issues that are brought up to them. Samuel will be outlining the next few steps. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Satvika. At the outset, we expected the program to mainly help alleviate social and mental distress. But interestingly, 80% of our students have expressed the need for academic support. In the future, the reason we've put on faculty involvement there is that we are looking at possibilities where faculty members could help train our volunteers navigate ways to provide academic support. Lastly, 50% of our students said mailers and Canvas announcements were effective ways to reach them. Canvas is a learning management system that we've recently launched. And 35% of students mentioned that they would use the program if they were acquainted with our volunteers. So having seen all this, we concluded that a multi-pronged strategy to increase visibility could help socialize the program a little better. This would incorporate periodic communication through mailers, social media strategy, and an intentional series of informal interactions with our volunteers. So these are the ways we are continuing to find ways to contextualize this program to our unique context, sharing insights with partners, and constantly adapting the program to be as effective as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Satvika.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
John, you can, yeah. Thank you so much. So with that, Pramila, I would defer on to you for some of the comments across. The idea of just putting the peer support was just showing that in a small university of just 100 people, it just takes that kind of labor to get something going for mental well-being. And we're kind of looking at the magnanimity of the whole issue for other service providers in the country. So over to you, Pramila.
Thank you very much, Kala. I first of all have to say what a wonderful program this has been, and congratulate all of you, Kala and team, and all the presenters for bringing this together at such short notice and with such a high standard as well. So thank you all very much. Just a quick overview. We started off, which was very nice, with what happens with the media, going on specifically to issues related to migrants, specifically looking at the construction industry sector, and then going on specifically issues related to women who bear the biggest burden, unseen and unheard and unrecognized, even before COVID, which has been exacerbated during COVID. And as we've seen in everything, including domestic violence, has become so much more, and it's an important area for us to look at. And all this with an overview of mental health, which has been a major issue, again, exasperated by COVID. And as several of you have said, COVID has brought a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. And it was really exciting to see, the review that you have brought together, a really good review in such a short time, and also the qualitative work that is done beyond that. One of the main things that we were excited about when we came together with CREA was that we didn't want to have research, as is done a lot of the time, just for the sake of research. Of course, that's important, getting your PhDs and whatever, and sitting in ivory towers. But we wanted research that was embedded and useful to the people who we were helping and working with. And again, this has shown, especially at that slide which showed the leverage of evidence, what a great group of people we are collaborating and working with, NGOs, end users, and this has to be the foundation of all the work we do. And looking at the insights and reflections, not just with the professionals and organizations, going on to policy makers, and not forgetting carers, the people, the patients involved, and being very holistic, and especially, which a lot of the time we tend to forget, is looking at the actual people, the personal end of it, with the people, the researchers, the students, and the others, and the professionals, health workers who are involved, because a lot of the time that that seems to sort of be sidelined. And so a wonderful holistic view at all of this. So thank you very much. And hopefully this will be the kickstart and the beginning of a wonderful, long and useful collaboration. Thank you all very much, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pramila. And as Pramila hinted, this is only the first part of the initiative. We will roll into the next year, and we are looking at bringing more, creating knowledge through either AV and so many other areas that we can at least it's given us a base of which direction we will head. So with that, thank you, everyone. Faisal, any other closing notes from you? And
no, just to join Pramila in congratulating you all and thanking you. I've been making notes as I've been listening to these wonderful presentations, and there are any number of questions I have, but we have I think we have gone through our schedule, and I don't want to take up anyone's time, but so many really crucial issues that are raised, big questions such as why, even before COVID, should the participation of Indian women in the labor force decline? Extraordinary situation that, as we were told, defies the global pattern. As a historian, I was very interested in seeing how the way in which labor is mobilized in India, even in new fields such as modern construction, still seems to follow some of the patterns that historians like Raj Chandravarkar pointed out already existed in the 19th century on Bombay mill floors, factory floors. The use of what today I call micro contractors, for instance, who are taken from the labor force itself, and who therefore are Jainists they face in both directions. They are agents of management on the one hand, but agents of labor on the other, and they're the crucial figures in the mobilization and deployment of labor. So I was very, very interested in these issues. So there's a lot to explore here, and I hope we can work together to coordinate such avenues of research across disciplines, which is also what has happened today. So again, thank you very much indeed for your time and effort, and many congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks presenters. Thanks for the audience who sat back to listen in, and we'll continue with this initiative, and it'll have much more interesting avenues to explore. We've just kind of scratched the surface of where it goes. So thank you, Dean Vishnu, for making time for sitting in through this. Highly recognize and respect your time, and thanks for actually initiating this whole thing with Oxford. Couldn't thank you enough for that. Well done, Kaustav, Ananya, Satvika, on your engagement across many things beyond academics, and I'm very happy at CREA. This is what we do well, to give students the opportunity to go and explore other angles. And our presenters, Sapna, Neha had to leave. I mean, it was a holiday. Priyansha, thank you so much. That was great. We do look forward to our students working with organizations like ComSco and Migration Now and some of your research, and understand all of that. And Diksha, on behalf of LEAD, thank you for coordinating. Preeti, for your contribution. And Sam, thank you. I mean, it's great what you're doing with the peer support program, and I'm definitely going to get you to reach out to Faisal and Pramila to understand if we can take off some lessons with Oxford and how do we improve this program, because we have quite an opportunity to make this kind of an example for, I don't think there's many universities invest in something like this in India, and we have quite an example to make out of it. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic. And thanks for sparing your end of year evening with us. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.